And um, yeah, it's wonderful to see everybody tonight and to share in this sangha. Um, and let us begin with a short sit. I don't know how well my bell would sound, so I'm just going to go bing and have us sit and do a settling sit, which is what we usually do when we go into Salinas Valley Prison. So letting yourself settle and be in a position that's alert and confident, yet not rigid. And so letting your jaw and your eyes relax. And letting your eyes, whether they're open or shut, turn down and towards your heart. And let's breathe together across the internet for about
Sorry.
Mm. Thank you so much, gentle friends, new and old. And yeah, I'm also feeling a lot of heaviness because of, knowing what's going on with the fires and how we can unfortunately just expect more and more of this, natural catastrophes exacerbated by, I mean, it's impossible to plan for everything. So, of course, there are always going to be errors, mistakes, problems, because we live in the material world. And that's exactly what the teaching of the Buddha is. Um, and so, just feeling very tenderhearted now. And the fire reminds me of all the war, all the attacks, all the viciousness and divisiveness and greed and hostility that's going on world. I mean, I could probably go on and just list a bunch of horrifying adjectives of things that are characterizing the world now, even though we all have so much to be grateful for. And as Paul was talking about his sister and mentioning her, that she's very privileged and she's suffering. I mean, of course, I don't know everybody's circumstances here, but I know relative to people who've just lost their homes for whatever reason or who are living under horrible circumstances, we can fortunately call ourselves privileged at this moment and realize that, as Max said, talking about his beautiful home on the mountainside, we have to look around and realize we're all at risk, and we always are. And of course, that's one of the great truths that we learn in Buddhism. So tonight, what I wanted to talk about um, really was just that. Um, I don't think anybody, I mean, I'm sure we've all had marvelous things that happened to us this year, but there were also very many unsettling things that have happened worldwide. And that's one thing we talk about in our rolling sangha when Vicky and Nancy and Bruce and Jill and I drive down to Salinas Valley Prison. And it's one thing we often talk about with the men there. And of course, we brought it up in this sangha here is how do you maintain the Brahma Viharas and cultivate them in an atmosphere where you might feel a lot of fear, a lot of resistance, a lot of anger, a lot of sadness, a lot of despair, and other things that make it hard to have a joyful radiation of our best selves. I'll just put it that way. And I mean, to me, that is really the main lesson of what Buddhism is about. And what the Buddha said, I mean, he's somebody that was born into amazing material circumstances, but his very birth brought about the death of his mother. the person that you're going to be closest to, especially in the first part of your life, ideally. And so that was something that he had to face from the moment. In fact, his birth caused her death. And, that was something that um, then his father wanted to push him into a certain path and put him in a very artificial situation, no matter how full of enjoyment it was and material pleasures. It was very, there was something artificial about it. That's what we hear about. And then he came to the realizations of that, yes, life is suffering. So that was his lesson. He lived in a time where there were war, there was famine. When he had his own sangha, one of his closest relatives tried to betray him. He did betray him. And so there are just all these things we realize that, as he says, life is suffering. And as the five remembrances tell us, we can never, ever get away from that. So, and one thing I love about Thich Nhat Hanh, and I'm not versed in all the different paths of Buddhism, of course, and I don't really know even, I don't pretend to know very much about the Plum Village tradition, but one thing that drew it to me, besides the wonderful people in my Sangha in Santa Cruz, was the very fact that Thich Nhat Hanh, coming from Vietnam during the time of the war against the U.S., or rather I should say the U.S. and France were warring on Vietnam, he wanted to make sure that people saw the beauty as well as the suffering. And one moment of transformation for him was when he was mourning the death of his mother as a young monk, and came to the realization that he really felt her in him. And he really saw there is no separation on a certain level between birth and death, between ourselves and other beings. And so that's one of his big this is a message in Buddhism, but I think it's something that the Plum Village tradition really emphasizes, is one way that we're going to overcome the obstacles, and it's kind of a basis for every step on the Eightfold Path, is joy and finding happiness, finding resilience, finding community. Um, and I know that's one thing I talk about a lot, because I really feel like the Sangha holds up not just me, it holds all of us up in a beautiful network, a beautiful web. And when we look around in patterns in nature, they're all composed of, every pattern, of course, is composed of elements, right? So we can never get away from being part of a whole, right? Um, and so when I think about things that happen and just feel this tenderness. When I was younger, and I'm talking about until I was in my 40s, because I'm in my 60s, a lot of times I would get upset because maybe I always felt driven to work on different, you might say, like social causes, like the environment, or racism or sexism, or just whatever, things I saw as societal problems. But I would feel a lot of anger and self-righteousness, I have to admit, and wonder how come things aren't, how come people can't learn? And then at a certain point, I think a lot of it was due to my meditation. I came to the realization of, this is just the way thing is. We can't expect, we can't, what can I say? We don't know any better. I guess this thing, it's like, we didn't have an example of, there's not another species that we know of that is like us. We should go thank heavens, right? But you know what I mean? It's like, okay, we're just learning and growing, right? And of course there are going to be a lot of mistakes on the path, and tragic mistakes, terrible mistakes, harmful mistakes. Um, but that shouldn't detract us from the joy and the beauty of all the creativity. And I think it was Alyssa who pointed out, whose word was community, because and probably if you're down in Los Angeles area or have friends down there, you've heard of examples of how people are coming together. So what I really wanted to talk about in this talk was, that's the background and some personal, and then go into some personal ways that when my mind goes off into kind of it goes into a negative spiral, or I start brooding or dwelling on unpleasant things that I can't really do anything about, or instead of thinking about what am I going to do to be proactive, I get stuck in a very negative, unbeneficial, or harmful, unskillful mindset. How do I bring myself out? And these are all things that do come from, they're all lessons that are brought to us from Buddhism, and not just Buddhism. I mean, of course, many, many other wise people and a lot of scientific research have come up with the same, the same things. But since we're in a Buddhist sangha, so I'm going to talk about them from a Buddhist thing. And since I practice Buddhism, I often just kind of translate things people tell me into my mind into a Buddhist, Buddhist way, because that's the easiest way a lot of times for me to digest it. Um, and so the first thing I really want to talk about tonight was this great idea of changing the peg, which comes from one of the sutras. And when I first heard, and when I first heard about this, I was going through a super deep depression because my home had been burnt down in the fire. But before it was burnt down, we had the COVID epidemic. So I was laid off from my job, and thankfully we didn't have financial worries, but all of a sudden I was laid off from my job. I worked in the library. I enjoyed my job. I had friends and patrons I liked at the job, and all of a sudden it was gone. And we were stuck in the house, right? And all those COVID things, we didn't really know how contagious is it. I mean, but there was just a lot of uncertainty and fear and change, disruption. And then my husband of those days just totally went down a completely different rabbit hole than I did. And, just thought all this stuff about COVID, like such as it's not really a disease, to where, it's not really, anyway, I won't go into what he thought, except that it meant that he wasn't going to be doing anything that was recommended, like wearing masks or socially distancing or things of that nature, to where I didn't feel safe, and neither did our grandchild who was living with us at the time. But we all tried to cope and get along with that and everything. And then finally it got to the point where I left the house, and then but shortly after I left, you could say the house left us, because the house burned down in the CCU fire. So and and then I was living with this friend of mine in Half Moon Bay. It was a very crowded situation. So there were things of, and she was a recent widow, and somebody else was staying with us who was having their own domestic problems, and me, I was having a lot of problems. And then her, my friend's granddaughter, who was only like 9 at the time. So you can imagine it was very frazzling, fraught situation. And that's when I first heard about changing the peg, because I just felt, I mean, I don't think I've ever felt worse in my entire life. And I was just so high strung and always trying to think. I mean, I was trying to figure things out and over intellectualizing and ruminating, and not, I was afraid to go out, couldn't really socialize because of COVID. And it was even, the weather wasn't so good to where it wasn't even easy to be outside so much. It was just a very, frustrating. I was in a very frustrated, dim mood. And then when I heard about, and so I was always trying to figure things out in my mind. I was thinking, okay, I always hear about how in Buddhism and a lot of other disciplines, it's really emphasized, don't turn away from the bad things, really go toward the bad things. And so I'm like, okay, I'll think about the bad things. And I used to just beat myself up because I always wondered, what's wrong with me? I'm just, what's wrong with me? I can't really cry. I mean, all these bad things have happened. How come I've never had a breakdown and just sat and sobbed? And I mean, probably the reason was I didn't feel safe enough to sit and sob. But at the time, so I was even beating myself up for, why am I not crying? Am I just a cold, heartless beast? I should really do that sitting in the fire more and delve into it. So it wasn't until I heard this great idea of changing the peg, which is simply, hey, if you have, it's based on the whole idea of when people had homes that were made out of wood, like they did in Buddhist time. It was very common that, I don't know how much metal they had back then, but not a whole lot. And so the buildings would be, the structures would be put together with wooden pegs. And when one went bad, one method of clearing it out and replacing it was simply to take a new wooden peg and hammer it through the old one. And the old one was so soft and ineffective that it just, you know, it was just flushed out, you might say. And so that's the whole idea of changing the peg is, hey, you don't have to worry about pulling out every old splinter, the bad wood, just put in a new one and replace it. And you're not, what can I say? It's not like you're covering something up, or it's not bad. In fact, this is a really good fix. So when I heard the change in the peg, it helped me kind of turn my mental state around. And it really, now when I look back on that time, it was very painful. And it would have been it would have been painful no matter what, because it was a hard time. But I was adding so many second arrows of suffering to it by all my misunderstandings, that when I learned about changing the peg, I'm like, this is such a great idea. Now I don't have to just emphasize my suffering, and I'm not in a state to look at my suffering. I'm too close to it. And that was a lesson that somehow, probably because I had never been in such a terrible situation before, I hadn't, I hadn't really ever had to really look at things that way. Like probably before, when I had kind of been stuck in brooding and whatnot, it hadn't just been to such a severe extent that it had such a bad effect on me and people around me and everything, right? So this change in the peg, um, it gave me a new way of looking at things. And I realized Buddhism's so beautiful, because another thing that Buddha taught was that you speak to people where they are. Like, um, and I had to learn to speak to myself where I was, right? And that's so good, because that's a really good life lesson to all of us in every circumstance. Is, of course, it's the Buddha set us a wonderful example. And of course, that's something that would be so much of a better thing to do now. Like now I'm still involved in different activism, but I don't approach other people so much as my adversaries. And I can think of several people right now that I've had to meet with that I can't stand. And unfortunately, well, okay, I can't stand them. They're not my favorite people. It's hard to stand them. It's hard to have good thoughts towards them. And some of these people are even people that were trying to do the same thing, but I just don't like them, and they don't like me, for what, you know what I mean? For whatever reason. And it's just like, okay, how do we get beyond that and just learn how to speak to each other, how to keep our hearts open? I can't really, of course, force anybody else to keep their heart open. All I can do is try to keep my heart open enough. And so, um, and that's, of course, something that I learned from Buddhism, because Buddhism has that beautiful idea of non-duality, and even that idea of impermanence, where somebody that you go see, I'm thinking of some people in leadership and that I've gone to see them many, many, many times. And in some ways, we're even friendly. And it's not like we're adversarial. We're friendly and polite to each other. I know they think that I'm a nut, or my ideas are, they just don't care. But, we kind of like each other as people. And that's very important, that relationship. But the other thing is, I know too that I and my, not just me, but other people that feel like me, we have to keep working on that person and other people, because they might change. We can never say, because nothing is permanent. Somebody can always change, and not only can they always change, but they can change for the better. Or, when I say for the better, I mean for the more beneficial. So, and another thing that's taught me is, like I'm using these terms like better, and I try to avoid those kinds of labeling. But along with changing the peg, another thing that I found is so useful is the idea of labeling thinking. And I know, a lot of times in meditation, we're told, hey, when you're breathing in and breathing out, and that's the focus of your meditation, whatever the focus of your meditation is, when an intrusive thought comes in, you can just label it thinking. And, even when you've caught yourself, like, you've been thinking about this thing for quite a while, and then just go thinking, and just go right back to trying to keep your track of your breath or whatever. And so I found that labeling was so useful to me, when I would start to feel these whatever thoughts I was feeling that weren't useful, I could just tell, like, if I started to feel a certain way, like, oh, I'm not really up to doing whatever a task was, or I'm afraid to do something or other. I would just tell myself, hey, that's just depressive thinking. I could just label it. And so I really recommend that. And for that matter, a long time ago, even before became a Buddhist, I used to smoke cigarettes, and I told myself, hey, I'm going to quit smoking. And this was back in the day where everybody could smoke anywhere practically, right? And yeah, and I would be, I would see people lighting up cigarettes. So of course, my first thought was, hey, I want a cigarette. And then my second thought would be, I wonder if I could bum a cigarette from them or whatever, right? And then, and then I would have to go, wait, okay, replace that thought. I've just replaced it with, hey, remember why you quit smoking? It's because your hair would smell so bad, or your clothes, or you had that cough, or, just whatever it was. And so I think there's sometimes where, we can do thought replacement by, what can I say, by thinking about something that's totally off the subject from what we're brooding about, or we can use something that is very much in line with the issue we're dealing with right at the moment. And to my mind, these are all the skillful techniques that we can use. And then I want to talk to you about, gosh, just the idea of right listening. And in my sangha, I'm sorry, right speech. And so in our sangha, which is the Heart Sangha in Santa Cruz, one thing that we always emphasize whenever we do our recitation of the 5 precepts, of which right speech is one, we always talk about how right listening is also part of right speech. And so when I'm with people, especially people that I don't agree with, and especially with people that I happen to think are taking an ethical stance that is, not really ethical, or anything where, I'll just put it this way, I think people are wrong and are actually causing damage, and I'm in a position to talk to them. And then I just have to tell myself, hey, I want to have right listening and really understand and have an open mind. Like this happened during COVID so often. And I'm sure all of y'all experienced that with people who, whatever you thought about COVID, you probably met so many people who thought things about COVID that, really alarmed you or scared you or made you angry. And just whenever I hear something, some people start talking like that, as soon as I can, I just try to put myself in a mind of respectful, having respect for people. And I think that's one thing that Thich Nhat Hanh meant when he was actually talking about um, sangha, and having really everybody be in our sangha, which is the same idea that Martin Luther King and the Berrigan brothers and people like Fannie Lou Hamer all had about the beloved community, right? And so making the sangha, trying to make our sangha as inclusive as we can. So just to sum up before we go back into meditation, those are the ideas I wanted to bring out, um, you know, and just say, hey, if we can all remember, we don't have to figure things out. I think that's part of the great thing about changing the peg. We don't really have to figure out why something happened or why we reacted or somebody else reacted the way we did. We can just go, hey, for whatever reason, we just need to repair that, right? We need to, and by repair, I mean, we need to put our mind, our thoughts in a healthier way. And the same thing with labeling. And that's why it can be so good to just, like if I'm going down the road and starting to get angry, I can just tell myself, okay, that's just angry thinking, or for that matter, that's just, you know, hungry thinking, you know, or that's, let me look at somebody else's side of it. And also to really remember the whole concept of impermanence and go, things are not always going to be like this. And even to have humility with right speech, also to go, right speech and right listening, also to think, this goes into with right view, is to go, we don't know, we can't see the whole picture. And so always know that we can learn from somebody, even somebody that, experience has never caused us to learn anything from them before, you know. So, and with that in mind, I'd like us to go back into and finish up with, I guess, about an 8 or 9 minute meditation, and or let's say more like a contemplation. And then when you're meditating, being gentle with yourself, and when something comes up, labeling it. You know, what kind of thought is it? And not, I know we're all experienced enough meditators to just expect that we're going to go off topic in our meditation, but to really be so kindly towards ourselves and think about, maybe bring into mind somebody you want to send compassion to, and just see who pops up for you, you know, or if there's someone or something that you're having trouble dealing with, just as you meditate, really looking at your thought and thinking, like, is this from anger, is this from fear, what can I replace that with, how can I change the peg on that? So with that said, like I said, my bell's probably not going to ring, so I'm just going to go ring.